Good morning to everyone. I'd actually like to begin by thanking the translators for a really excellent job. It's very much appreciated. I'm with a company called InterVISTAS Consulting. This is the very short commercial, but so you know who we are. We're a company of about 75 people. Our headquarters are in Vancouver in Canada. That's on the Pacific, not the Atlantic side of Canada. We also have major offices in London, The Hague, and Washington, D.C. And we work in all sectors of aviation, especially airports, airlines, and to some extent air navigation. The topic I've been asked to address is how legacy air carriers cope with liberalization. Often I'm actually speaking about low-cost carriers and the different types of low-cost carrier business models and so on. But the theme here, I think, about how does a legacy carrier survive against competition is probably very important. I thought I'd begin with a few remarks about liberalization. Liberalization does produce significant consumer benefits. It's been found to stimulate airline or aviation sector employment, including at the airlines, has a dramatic effect on inbound tourism, and indeed there are a number of economies where they're actually willing to subsidize air carriers. Seychelles comes to mind because of the tremendous economic benefits that the air passengers create when they come into the country and spend on tourism. In Canada, for example, we found that the average Chinese tourist is spending a little bit under $3,000 per visitor. Those are real dollars, not U.S. dollars or Canadian dollars. We've waited 30 years to be able to say that. And a study that we at InterVISTAS did for the International Air Transport Association, we actually looked at the impact of aviation connectivity on a nation's overall economic productivity. And there we actually found that we did a similar study in the telecommunications sector, but aviation increases the economy not just because of aviation employment itself, but aviation connectivity makes other industries in the economy more productive. It connects them to more markets, and it actually leads to sustained increases in gross domestic product. Getting used to this. In terms of liberalization, we've found, for example, in the European Union that there was an 88% increase in routes with more than one air carrier, major reduction in airfares, 34% in inflation-adjusted terms. We did another study that looked at open sky type bilaterals, and we found that while the range of traffic increases from such bilateral varies from market to market, the average was about 33%. I'm actually going to give a short case study on the smallest of these, which was the Moroccan Open Skies bilateral with the European Union. Often overlooked, though, is the impact of aviation on freight rates, and we find that liberalization generally will reduce freight rates somewhere in that 15 to 22% range. And that can actually be quite significant because there's a lot of goods that are not economic to move by air at past rates, but if rates come down about 20%, the economic shifts quite a bit, and all of a sudden they will start to make greater use of air transportation. The deregulation as well as liberalization, partially privatization, has resulted in the emergence of a new set of air carriers, especially the low-cost carriers, and now a new term we're hearing is the ultra-low-cost carriers. Many of the low-cost carriers have started to evolve their business model where they, for example, in Australia, Virgin Australia now offers a business class cabin, it has business class lounges, it has interline agreements with a number of air carriers. But there's other carriers like Tiger in Australia or Ryanair in Europe. In North America, we have a carrier called Allegiant, which is one of the most profitable airlines in the world. And they're often referred to as the ultra low-cost carriers, meaning that they're focused on operating at the lowest cost and the lowest fares, and they have no intention, at least at the moment, of expanding into some of the other areas like business class and interline agreements and so forth. We're also seeing low-cost carriers showing up in medium and in some cases now long-haul international markets. In Australia, Qantas has a low-cost carrier subsidiary called Jetstar, and Jetstar is now flying routes that are in the 6 to 10 hour range, and they eventually will be flying a route such as Sydney, Australia to Vancouver, Canada, and that's actually a 16-hour flight, and that's scheduled to be one of the first routes that will be operated by Jetstar when they take delivery of their 787s. This is a cartoon or a graph that sort of shows some of the market share change. In this case, this is European Union, intra-European Union, so some people would call this domestic. You can see that in the year 2000, the low-cost carriers had a 16% market share. That's the light blue box at the very top on the left bar. The right bar then updates this for 10 years to the year 2010, and there we can see the low-cost carriers are about 45%. Now this is in terms of seats rather than in terms of passengers. Earlier data that was presented by IATA has this number about 40%. Now what's very important here is that the legacy carriers not only have lost market share, but they're actually smaller. So you can see the green bar at the bottom of the two. The right bar for the legacy carriers is actually smaller. So they actually have withdrawn some of their capacity out of intra-European markets. This slide, though, shows where they've redeployed the capacity. So this is European Union legacy carrier capacity on routes outside of the European Union. So this may be routes into countries like Morocco or Israel, North America, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and to some extent Africa. So there's actually been a 47% growth rate in their seat capacity in that 10-year period. So what we're seeing is that as we deregulate and liberalize markets, the low-cost carrier model seems well suited for the short haul to short medium haul markets. The legacy carriers with higher costs are finding that they have a better advantage in the medium to long haul markets and have been redeploying their resources appropriately. Now this is an example of a liberalization market. So this is Morocco, which is not a part of the European Union, but which signed an open skies agreement in 2006 with the European Union. And the blue area at the top is Royal Air Maroc, so the national airline of Morocco. Down at the bottom on the left, there's a gray area, and that's other airlines. So that would include European airlines, for example. The vertical line is at 2006, and what you can see is that the total market has grown quite dramatically. It was on a very rapid rate of increase in growth, and then of course, starting in 2008, we had the fairly dramatic economic adjustments in a lot of economies in the world. So the growth rates dropped off, but that's largely attributed to economic conditions as opposed to liberalization itself. Royal Air Maroc actually has lost market share. It used to have 66% of the market share in the left area in 2005, but by 2010, its market share dropped to 47%. But the actual total traffic that it carries increased by 50%. So while it's lost market share, it nevertheless has grown in terms of its traffic between Morocco and the European Union. The other airlines, which largely include the legacy airlines from Europe, they've actually declined. They rose at first and then they've declined, so they're basically, their capacity is just a little bit less. Oh, thank you very much. Their capacity is a little bit less than what it was when the Open Skies agreement began. Then, of course, there's been a big expansion by the European low-cost carriers, EasyJet and Ryanair, into the Moroccan air market, which has also stimulated tourism. And now we have Air Arabia Morocco as well that has emerged. So this is a case where this is an example where a legacy carrier has ceded or lost market share, but it has grown nevertheless. Now, A lot of economists, including myself, sing the praises of low-cost carriers and what they can do for tourism and an economy. But I want to make very clear that there's still a very, very important role for legacy carriers for nations in their commerce. Legacy carriers play a critical role in how a nation is connected. The low-cost carrier business model is one that almost rejects connectivity. In fact, the CEO of Ryanair, Pope Michael Orion, he actually says that connectivity costs $100 per passenger. Not $100 per passenger to make a connection, but the average cost per passenger for an airline of being able to offer interline connections is $100. And that's why Michael O'Leary has rejected connectivity even between his own flights. So if you're coming in from Dublin to Stansted and you want to make a connection to Carcassonne in France, he will try not to sell you a ticket with that. People may buy 2 separate tickets, but he will not transfer your bag because his view is that cost is about $100 per passenger. I don't think it's quite that high, but it is considerable. It'd certainly be at least $50 a passenger. So the legacy carriers are the ones that provide connectivity into the nation. And in many cases, that type of connectivity actually brings in high-value inbound tourists. In fact, you won't see Ryanair bringing in new tourists into Europe, at least not yet. We'll see what happens with their attempt to acquire Aer Lingus. That's still the legacy air carrier that's providing the high-value intercontinental traveler. They're also the ones that provide near-seamless interline connections in the world. The interline system that IATA has built up over the last 60 to 70 years has been a tremendous success. And I know some governments don't like the old price establishment roles of IATA, but I think that every government needs to tip their hat to IATA in how they've made interline service very seamless and very effective. The legacy carriers are also the ones that are typically providing much of the air cargo capacity. Many of the low-cost carriers actually reject air cargo as a business line, and in many cases, because they want to have rapid turn of their aircraft, they'll choose to not handle any cargo at all. And another often overlooked area is the legacy carriers often provide some other social services. In Canada, I was involved in a regulatory proceeding involving Air Canada, our legacy carrier, and WestJet, our quasi-low-cost carrier. And one of the things I found is that the legacy carriers will provide onboard oxygen for patients who need oxygen in order to be mobile, whereas many of the low-cost carriers will not do that. WestJet, for example, our low-cost carrier, does not have a hazardous materials license. They've chosen, as they made a business decision, not to do that, and that means that they cannot have pressurized oxygen on board the aircraft other than for the aircraft systems themselves. So the only way they can accommodate a passenger who needs oxygen is if they bring in what's called a portable oxygen concentrator. They're sort of like little suitcases that run on batteries and basically concentrate oxygen from the air, but there's no pressurized container there. And it leads us to appreciate that the important role that the legacy carriers play. But there's been a big challenge for the legacy carriers in coping with liberalization of markets. When the low-cost carriers started to enter domestically, and then as they started to appear in international markets, the legacy carriers had no choice. They had to lower their fares in order to respond to the competitive challenge. And the really critical element was when the low-cost carriers, led by Southwest in the 1990s, offered low fares on a one-way basis. Now, prior to this, the legacy carriers offered low fares, but on a restricted basis. What they tried to do is identify those passengers who would only travel on a low fare, and they differentiated or distinguished them from passengers who were willing to buy the airline product at a high fare. They'd prefer to pay the low fare, but they were actually willing to pay the high fare. So they came up with a number of systems or techniques. Actually, Boeing led a lot of the development of this in the early 1970s, where in economics terminology we talk about price discrimination. And that is charging different customers different prices. And the way they did this was with capacity-controlled discount fares. So the classic capacity control would be that if you wanted a discount fare, you had to book the ticket, say, 3 weeks in advance when the moon was at the half phase or something like that, and you had to stay over a Saturday night. So they found a restriction that the people willing to pay a high fare, business travelers often, they're willing to pay the high fare. They don't want to abide by those restrictions because they're going to book late. They don't want to stay over a Saturday. And so this worked for the airlines, the legacy airlines. It allowed them to get a higher fare from some passengers while competing with low fares. And that worked until the low-cost carriers started to offer low fares on a one-way basis. Because now the business traveler could simply say, well, I'll buy 2 one-way tickets on Southwest or JetBlue or Virgin Blue or Ryanair. And they found that the traditional capacity-controlled restrictions of advanced purchase, and especially things like Saturday night stayovers, were no longer effective in price differentiating the markets. They could no longer charge a premium to a large part of the market. Most of the market moved down to low fares. And in the United States, for example, on the left-hand side, the economy fare from 1993 to 2003, when this is the period when the low-cost carriers really expanded in the U.S., it dropped from 14 cents to 9 cents. That's not on the low-cost carriers, that's on the legacy carriers. The legacy carriers suffered a major drop in their fares, and in fact, in the United States now, it's something like 90-some% of passengers, I think it's 94%, are traveling on a discount ticket or of one type or another. So the legacy carriers all of a sudden had to lower their fares for most of their tickets, and in many markets we see the legacy carriers now offering cheap one-way fares because they have to in order to compete where the low-cost carriers are present. Unfortunately, they had very high costs, so they dropped their fares to maintain market share and be competitive, but it set the stage for failure. So we had a large number of airlines that failed, and on the left side here I've got some examples. Some of these legacy carrier bankruptcies were what the U.S. calls Chapter 11, which is you go into bankruptcy so your old shareholders lose their equity, but you reorganize, you get some new equity finance, and you come out of bankruptcy. So United, Northwest, Delta, Air Canada. In Canada, we don't know where we're going to go when we die, but we know we'll make the connection on Air Canada. So these airlines were, Japan Airlines would be another one, that they were restructured, new equity was brought in. But then we had others where the airlines were simply liquidated. And the classic example here was Ansett Australia. On September 11th, 2001, unrelated to the terrorism event, on that day Ansett Airlines filed for bankruptcy and proceeded into complete liquidation. So the airline stopped flying and it no longer exists at all. There's other airlines that have also disappeared. Mexicana tried a Chapter 11 type bankruptcy, but eventually proceeded to Chapter 7, which is a liquidation. Now, so in Europe, we had Sabena and Swiss Air, which were interesting. Those airlines, those brands were liquidated, but then new airlines were started. In the case of Swiss Air, its feeder carrier, Crossair, became Swiss International, and it was kind of, in some ways, it had some elements of a Chapter 11 restructuring. Legacy carrier fares were so low that in many cases the break-even load factor exceeded 100%. So Northwest Airlines in 2003 had 102% a break-even load factor, and I have to admit that the crowded seats made it feel like it was standing room only, but it was a situation where even if they sold every seat on every flight, that the fares that they had to charge to compete with the low-cost carriers, they simply couldn't survive. It would not generate sufficient revenue to allow them to be economically viable. So what I want to turn to now is how legacy carriers have coped with this especially in roughly the last 5 to 8 years, as many of the carriers came out of bankruptcy in the mid-2000s. What have they done differently now to try and position themselves for survival? And I've got 4 main themes here. The first is that these carriers have to compete on price. They cannot afford to charge higher prices than the low-cost carriers. Second, they have to reduce their costs. It's absolutely essential. If you've got low fares, somehow you've got to get your costs down. Third, and I think this is a really important element, and that's to find new sources of value which will generate new revenue. So you may sell a basic airline product of transportation, but you find something else that you can attach to that, or maybe something you've already been providing that the customer is willing to pay more money for. And that's, in the economist term, I think the first 2 points I'm making here are that the airlines have to set the prices for their core transportation at marginal cost, because that's what the low-cost carriers do. But then what you have to do to cover your fixed costs is you have to find new sources of revenue that will be charged, maybe not to all consumers, but to many of the customers, so you can generate sufficient revenue now to cover your costs, plus a return on the capital that you need to borrow to operate your airline. And the fourth area is to increase your market scope via alliances, joint ventures, and investment. Find a way that you can get more traffic coming onto your airline, generating more revenue, again, to contribute to those fixed costs. So I'm going to cover each one of these in the remaining time of my presentation. So my first point is that a legacy carrier today must recognize that if you're in a liberalized market, most markets in the world now are, you have to compete on price. Not only are you competing against low-cost carriers, but you're also competing against aggressive legacy air carriers. In the United States, a few decades ago, Continental Airlines, which was a legacy carrier, went into bankruptcy twice. Actually, they got really good at it. And they actually came back into the market with, while they were not a low-cost carrier per se, they came in with a very aggressive pricing strategy in a lot of markets, which meant that the other airlines had to respond to them. And that's just the reality today in most markets, both domestic and international, is you're going to be competing with somebody on price. If it's not a low-cost carrier or a quasi-low-cost carrier, it'll be an aggressive legacy carrier. So you have to match the lower fares in the market. The alternative is a large loss of market share in traffic. It's my observation that, and I don't want to necessarily generalize this and say that this will apply to Israel. Israel is a unique economy, a unique a nation, and unique culture. But elsewhere in the world, it's my observation that it's very difficult to protect your national carrier. In Canada, we tried to do that, and we ended up with almost 15% of the market now drives across the border and picks up a U.S. airline. Canada's built right on top of the U.S. border there. In fact, the Canadian Airports Council recently hosted a conference about Canada's missing airport, and they actually determined that there's an airport a little bit smaller than Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport, but that's the collection of the U.S. airports in terms of the traffic that they're taking out of the market. Even a country like New Zealand found that it was very difficult for them to protect their air carrier, because the international carriers like Qantas would just take that traffic across on the short haul to Australia and then connect them on the long haul at very low airfares. As I indicated in economist terminology, the way the old legacy carrier model worked was price discrimination. Find a way to discriminate between those customers only willing to travel to low fare, offer them the low fare, and customers who have an ability to pay, maybe they don't want to, but they've got an ability to pay the high fare, charge them higher fares. And we did that by Saturday stayovers, minimum stays. But in the new markets where we have low one-way airfares, that price discrimination has disappeared. And it's disappeared even in long-haul markets. So I flew here from Vancouver to Tel Aviv. That's a very long haul market, and yet I was able to buy one-way airfares at essentially the same price as a round-trip ticket. I did not have to buy a round-trip ticket to enjoy a low airfare. In the U.S., here's where the number, by 2004, 95% of tickets in the U.S. were being sold at a discount fare class, with most of those actually being the first class fares, now called business class in the U.S. The second key point, though, is reducing costs. If forced into a low fare environment, you have to get your costs down. It's the only way that you're going to be able to survive for the long term. Now, often a lot of the focus, especially in the media, who look at the air transport industry sometimes in a superficial way, is they see the labor disputes and say, well, what the airlines are doing is they're trying to reduce their costs on the back of labor. So they try and get wages down from workers and so on. And there's certainly some truth to this with a number of airlines. But I don't think that's the whole story, nor do I think it's even the majority of the story. I think it's a small piece of the story. The main focus on the labor side has been elsewhere. Productivity gains were really important. For example, the U.S. legacy carriers had very restrictive work rules where in some airlines, pilots would only be flying about 45 to 50 hours per month, even though the FAA regulations would allow something in round numbers around 100, and more typically you'd see them at 75 to 80 hours a month. And getting new working agreements with the pilots' unions, same with flight attendants, led to a major growth of productivity. All of a sudden it reduced training costs, it reduced interrupt trip expenses, and so forth. Another key element of this process is to automate labor-intensive processes. So being able to make reservations via the internet has been tremendously successful, and IATA gets a lot of credit for their simplifying the air travel market initiatives of the previous administration at IATA. This was, not only did it reduce the costs of selling the ticket to the passenger, it actually led to a higher level of customer service, because all of a sudden the customer felt they were in more control of what it was they were going to buy, because on the internet they could actually see a lot more in terms of the way of options. Then of course the next step was to go to web-based check-in or kiosk check-in, and I think it's Ryanair that now charges if you use a real person agent at the airport to check in. They will charge you a fee for that. I think it's 425 euros to check in. They want you to check it, and you're supposed to laugh at that. But you're supposed to, they are encouraging you to check in on the web or to use a kiosk at the airport. Of course, a big step ahead that IATA masterminded was paperless ticketing. That dramatically simplified travel, not only for the airlines, for the bank settlement plans, but for the passengers themselves. And as my wife keeps pointing out, I no longer have red smears on the inside pockets of my suit and shirt from the old IATA ticket stock that they had. But cost reduction came in other areas as well. One of the main things we saw, a lot of people, the original view as well, the low-cost carriers will operate all the old airplanes that were inefficient. But actually what we found is they immediately went to the more efficient aircraft. More efficient airplanes that have much more reliability in terms of their engines, the newer models of aircraft, dramatically reduce maintenance costs, lead to higher reliability in operations, which in turn lowers your operating costs. The move away from 3-engine aircraft to 2-engine aircraft was also very important. I actually remember hearing I was flying once, and the father was traveling with his 2 children, and he was explaining to them the numbering system of Boeing aircraft, and he said, well, the 727 has 2 engines, and the 737 has 3 engines, and the 747 has 4 engines. I mean, he was wrong, of course, about the 737 and 27, but then I kind of thought about what did that mean for the 787, and more importantly, the 707. But The two-engine aircraft, I mean, there's certainly a role for the four-engine aircraft for large capacity and long range, but you know, things like the 737, the A330 have been very successful aircraft, and of course the new A350 and 787. These are all critical elements of cost reduction. You know, the 787 and A350 may reduce, depending on fuel prices, operating costs of the aircraft between 15 and 20%. That's very important in being able to remain competitive. But cost reductions have been in other areas. There's been rationalization of destinations and flying, transfer some routes to feeder carriers or alliance carriers. Reducing distribution costs. There's a big fight in the United States between the airlines in general and the GDS providers around distribution costs. There's been court cases alleging market power abuse by the GDS providers. One of those, the United Airlines lawsuit with Sabre. Didn't they also used to own Sabre? Anyways, that was actually settled last week, and we don't know what the terms are, but it was revealed that there was a large amount of cash that did move from Sabre to American Airlines. Did I say United? I meant to American Airlines. Also removing costs of services that are not required by all passengers. Not all passengers, for example, need to have a blanket and a pillow, so a lot of airlines simply removed that, and where they did provide it, they would charge a fee. Meals, actually we do a lot of customer service survey of passengers in airports, and one of the interesting things we found is a lot of passengers actually like the new regime. They'd never liked the meals airlines served on the aircraft. They actually like the ability to choose what they're going to buy either before they board the flight or on the flight, and many people are actually happy with the United Airlines Tapa snack box rather than the United Airlines meatloaf and canned peas that they used to serve. Baggage interrupted trip services, legroom, and so forth. Let me turn now, because I've got 5 minutes left, to the third area, which I think is one of the keys to the future for the legacy airlines, and that's finding new sources of value. And the term that we economists and business management types talk about is the unbundling of the airline product. So the old product was a bundle. You bought a ticket and it gave you the basic transport, but you also got flexibility. In the old days, you could cancel the ticket and get a refund or change your flight plans at whim. You would get a meal on the plane, you'd get 2 free bags. Most of the time they'd get to your destination. You would get a blanket on the plane. It was just a package of services that you got. Now the model is to offer the core transportation product as an unbundled service at a really low, economist terminology, marginal cost base price. That's the key of the business model. Core transportation at a low price. Then what you want to do is you want to offer new sources of value. It may be the old sources, but you're going to have to pay for them. But we're going to identify what adds value over and above the core transportation, and we're going to merchandise those type of services. And this is the vocabulary we're starting to hear. Airlines talk about their new merchandising strategies of trying to sell higher value product packages. So instead of talking about bundling, they're talking about developing unique packages of services for customers and merchandising them. And this is a fundamental paradigm shift, because in the old days, the GDSs actually only will show the lowest fare that you can travel at in the market. They'll only show one fare per flight. And we often referred to that, as a mass commoditization or a mass standardization of the airline product. These days, the terms that they're using are mass customization of the airline product. When my daughter travels, maybe she needs only core transportation services. When my other daughter travels, she typically will want to bring 2 or 3 bags. She wants priority check-in. She's going to want a blanket on the plane, and she wants to buy the meal in advance. And so the airline will identify what the package is she wants, and they will offer her a price for that merchandise that they're going to sell to her. So the unbundling has led to the separate charging for different services. There's a separate charge for seat selection. That used to be free. Well, now many airlines are going to charge you for that. For priority boarding, you can pay a fee for that, or they can reward high-frequency travel customers. Some legroom is costly. If you make all the seats further apart, that costs money. But some legroom is free because there's rules about legroom or distance between seats in the exit row and on the bulkhead, and airlines have discovered we can charge for that. Now, the amount of revenue may not seem like a lot, but if you add $200 per flight from those charges alone on an airline that flies 2,000 flights per day, 365 days of the year, that actually ends up in millions of additional dollars in revenues there. So you sell these higher value packages. Now, ancillary revenue in the U.S. in 2010 was $58 billion globally. That 58 should be $58 billion. Which is about 12% of airline revenues. It's a little bit of an overstatement because there was some of this revenue in the past for things like extra baggage, and there were some duty-free sales of the airlines. But this is a plot from CAPA that shows U.S. airline baggage fee revenue, and you can see starting in 2008, as the airlines started to develop this merchandising approach, you can see the dramatic ramp up in baggage fee revenues. This is a graph that shows which airlines have the largest percentages of ancillary. So here's Allegiant, this ultra low-cost, highly profitable airline in the U.S., which 30% of their revenue are now ancillaries. Ryanair's over 20%. You've got Gull, which is a low-cost carrier in Brazil. This is baggage fees as a percent of revenue, and here we actually have some of the legacy carriers. So here's U.S. Airways and Delta, United Airlines at 1.7% of revenue, but 1.7 or 2% of revenue on a $20 billion a year airline is actually the entire amount of their profit. In fact, ancillary revenues for the U.S. Air carriers is the entire amount of their profits collectively. Now here's a demonstration of how the airlines actually do this, and I'm right near the end because I think this thing's going to beep or explode or something. This is Air Canada. So Air Canada, these are flights from Toronto to Vancouver. If you live in Vancouver, I don't know why you'd want to fly to Toronto, but if you did. So the old way of displaying fares, this is what the GDSs will display. They will simply show you the lowest fare. So in GDS, on Air Canada Flight 109 will show you $379. On Flight 101, the lowest fare available is $509, so they will display that. But what the airline-based systems are doing now, and there are some online travel agencies that can now do this using some of the new software that's available, but what they're going to do is they're going to sell you a range, they're going to offer you different packages of merchandise you can buy. So you can pay $379, or you can go to $444 and buy the Tango Plus product. And so now you look up Tango Plus, and Air Canada will tell you what you get. You can change your plans for only $50 and so on. And it goes on, they'll tell you how many bags you can get, whether you get lounge access and so on. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to sell you the additional value and trying to get you to voluntarily give the airline more revenue for some elements of airline service that has value for you, and yet they can compete effectively on the base price. This is Air New Zealand showing how they do it. It's essentially the same thing, but they're a little more clever, so they actually have names like, here's Grab a Seat, which is a seat only, $99. Here's Grab a Seat plus bag, so you get one bag. So $10 if you do it at the time of reservation, it's like $40 at the airport. Smart Saver will give you 2 bags, and then they've got the Flexi Plus and so on. Now the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I am out of time, was alliances, and let me just make a few very brief remarks. Alliances allow airlines to extend market access. You may fly, for example, to Hong Kong, but that only allows you to get passengers originating or destined in Hong Kong. What the alliance will do is gather people at the far end from other cities in that part of China, for example, or Taiwan and the Philippines, and get them onto your flight for the long-haul air service. We're also seeing, for example, here's a good example. Air New Zealand is now reducing its costs On the route that goes Auckland, Hong Kong, London, Heathrow, it's no longer going to operate itself, Hong Kong, London, Heathrow. That route is now going to be operated by Cathay Pacific for them. So Air New Zealand will operate from Australia to Auckland, and Cathay will as well. But then for the beyond traffic, all the Air New Zealand customers will be transferred to Cathay Pacific. And Cathay is a one-world carrier, and Air New Zealand this week is a Star Alliance air carrier. So alliances are not necessarily confined to the global alliances themselves. I have a few other remarks here about joint ventures and so on. I think I will skip those. There are some challenges with alliances, and I'm happy to talk afterwards with anyone that's interested. But let me just conclude here. Liberalization does produce benefits for consumers, but it has dramatic impacts on the financial viability of legacy carriers. But the legacy carriers are showing that they can survive and prosper. It requires them to develop new strategies. They have to match the low prices for the core transportation. But what they're learning about is how they can unbundle the product, go into merchandising strategies, and sell some aspects of their service for a premium. You don't have to buy that, it's voluntary, but that amount of revenue, it may actually be the amount of revenue that will cover your fixed costs and provide a return to your shareholders. So let me just conclude with a picture of the new, this will be, I guess, the Airbus A390, based on counting the engine. So thank you very much.